Hey everybody, and welcome to Real Film Talk, a show about everything from the biggest blockbuster hits to award-winning indie darlings. We like to look at today's top films a bit more critically than your average viewer, putting our film studies degrees to the test. I'm your host, Cassie Bauer, and today I am joined once again by Sophie Saylor. Sophie, welcome back to the pod.
Hello!
Sophie, do you want to give the listeners a little refresher? Who are you? What do you do here on campus?
Okay, I'm Sophie Saylor. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Winnonan.
Yeah, she is.
Yeah, I work at KQAL as a disc jockey, and I work at TV Services. Woo-woo!
Yeah. She's so slay. Oh my gosh.
Oh my god.
Okay, so Sophie, today we're going to be doing things a little bit differently on the podcast. We're going to be doing a deep dive onto a quintessential writer and director of the 80s and 90s. When you think 80s culture, his name likely comes to mind. He makes teen and family comedies centered around class, individualism, and almost always have a touch of romance. Some of his notable films include 16 Candles, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and The Breakfast Club. If you haven't quite figured out who we're talking about yet, today we are discussing John Hughes.
Woo! Our favorite guy!
Woo! Father for real.
Yeah, we have a class on John Hughes as well, so we are going in depth on this man.
Yes. We are actually experts.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, Sophie, first I want to talk a little bit about each of our own personal connections to John Hughes. Who he is, maybe his films, maybe what significance they had to you growing up, things like that.
So I wouldn't say my family was a John Hughes family. We, at some point in my life, I watched The Breakfast Club, which was a great experience. It's a good film. But aside from that, like, for the other well-known ones, like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, 16 Candles, all those other quintessential John Hughes films, I never really watched them. I watched Ferris Bueller's Day Off, like, recently for the first time. But, like, even when I was talking to my mom about this class and, like, what I was doing, she was like, oh, yeah, like, I don't know, like, not my favorite director. So, yeah. So, it was, like, interesting. Because, like, my family is very, interesting because, like, my father and my mother have very different views on, like, television and what they like to see, and neither of them have to do, like, are John Hughes types. Like, my mom is very much into, like, documentaries and, like, stories, like, that are, like, hardcore and stuff like that. And my dad likes sci-fi. And so, like, neither of them are, like, happy-go-lucky, like, family films. So I never really grew up with that. But, like, watching them in class, honestly, I'm kind of glad. Because, like, most of the movies we watched are, like, not great. But aside from, like, the well-known ones, which are pretty good.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting because, like, we think about John Hughes and I really feel like a lot of people think 80s culture. Like, he just had such a significant stamp on 80s culture. And he made some really great films. The ones I mentioned earlier are just such staples. A lot of people call those three films, 16 Candles, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and The Breakfast Club, like, the teen trilogy of the 80s.
Yeah.
So those three films, like, people often referred to as, like, this teen trilogy. And I think I had seen, like, each of them kind of in passing. And I knew of them, but I didn't, like, I feel like I didn't grow up watching those.
Yeah.
At least his directorial ones. I feel like I grew up more on some of the things that he's written and the ones that are centered on kids more. Sort of his later work in the 90s, sort of more focused around children, I think. Especially, Curly Sue came out in the 90s, and then Home Alone movies. And I love the Home Alone movies so much. I did grow up watching those.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's kind of, like, where my personal connection was. But I was really excited to take this class because I've taken this class twice before, but it's always been about an actress, which was super interesting to, like, focalize and learn about film through a specific actress, but I really think it's helpful to analyze them through a director's body of work. But yeah. I feel like John Hughes is just a really important person to people, especially people who grew up in the 80s, and it sort of, like, shaped maybe how they think about themselves.
Yeah, that's interesting, because my mom grew up in, like, late 70s, early 80s, and she, like, that just wasn't something that she really, like, idolized, which is interesting because, like, John Hughes was a very 80s, like, very, like, wasn't a, we're going to talk about this later, but, like, an auteur for, like, the teen films, especially, like, the 80s teen films.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you think of that, like, my mom is, like, I don't know, she used to be a lawyer, like, she went to school for being a lawyer and stuff like that, so she loves, like, court dramas and, like, stuff like that, and, like, having to do with, like, real stories, which is interesting because that also, like, you know, in the 80s, like, I feel like crime shows, like, were really prevalent as well, and, like, they are today as well, but, like, when I think of the 80s, I think of, like, 60 Minutes, and I think of, like, stuff like that, so I don't know, just, like, another thing that could do with the 80s, but not John Hughes.
Yeah, I mean, the 80s is such, like, a prominent decade, because I think, like, the adults in the world right now that are, like, running things are children of the 80s, so they, like, grow up with fond nostalgia of that, so we see a lot of 80s content reflected in the media, or, like, I mean, this is an example, but, like, Stranger Things coming out, like, 80s culture was a huge wave. There was a huge wave of nostalgia for 80s culture when Stranger Things came out. And I think that kind of just still persists. And I think almost there might be, as time goes on a little more nostalgia for the 90s now, too. Yeah. Because, like, 90s babies are now, like, growing up and being adults and now making media that we can look and reflect back on.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it's interesting the way that, like, how art kind of imitates life and then life imitates art, and, like, we see what people think about their life reflected in the media and reflected in the films we watch, and I think that's a big part of what John Hughes films are, is they are trying to be honest portrayals of a version of life reflected in film, and then people look back on that and they think that that might have been how life was, or they might understand their life through that lens of the John Hughes kind of happy ending moral narrative, which I think brings us to, like, our next topic of discussion that I want to kind of hash out, is how do we define John Hughes' style? How might we define that? And I want to think about this using examples from his films. Yeah.
At least from the films that we've watched, he has a very clear understanding of, like, teens, especially during that time. When I think about him compared to, like, movies in general, I mean, he has a very clear definition of what a family should look like and what, like, life looks like, because he doesn't steer clear of, like, the same kind of person in most of his films. Like, there's not many, I mean, you know, we talk in our class about, like, talking about heavy topics and, like, talking about, like, more grittier topics in his films, but, like, honestly, it's not really, like, you know, we have, in Dutch, for example, like, they have they drive with some prostitutes, and the prostitutes steal from them, and then they're, like, homeless at one point, but, like, they make it out at the end of it, like, most Americans can't make it out of poverty, and most Americans, like, deal with, like, genuine issues like abortion and like a lot of, like, grittier topics than just driving with a prostitute, you know? And so, like, it is interesting to me, like, that we talk about those things as, like, grittier topics when, like, it's just people, and like, just because someone is aside from a middle to upper class person doesn't make them a grittier topic, you know? And, you know, the grittiest movie that I think we've seen is Curly Sue. You know, it's about a girl, she's, like, 10 years old or something, and she's with this man because he, like, hooked up with her mom, and her mom died, I think.
Something along those lines. Mom's not in the picture anymore. She's with, this man who is a father figure to her, and she just calls him Bill. And they're homeless, they live where they can, and they essentially scam people into free food, and that's how they survive.
And the interesting part about this for me is that, like, this is I would consider, like, a gritty film. I'm honestly surprised that it's considered a comedy, because so many parts of it are just so dramatic and so...
And I feel like that's, like, true of a lot of comedy films, that it's like, if you just look at it with a different lens, it becomes a way more serious movie. You take out the silly soundtrack, you take out the, like, gags, like the slapstick gags, and it's no longer a comedy.
Yeah. And then it's such a similar movie to Ferris Bueller.
Really?
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Yeah.
I didn't see that comparison. Okay.
At least because what we were talking about in our film class is in Curly Sue, they, there's a lot of cheating, there's a lot of, scamming people and stuff like that. And there was a lot of discussion around, like, why that's bad or why that's not bad. And in the podcast that we had to actually listen to for this class, they were very angry at the movie because no one deserved anything in the movie, and that's why it's a bad movie.
In Curly Sue.
Yes.
Yes.
And same thing happens to Ferris Bueller.
Ferris is a man of scams.
Yeah, like, he scams everyone in the movie. He scams to
his parents. He scams restaurants.
Yep.
He scams his principal.
I mean, he doesn't deserve anything. I mean, the house he lives in is his parents. Like, and people don't like Ferris in our in our class, so, like, that makes sense. But it's interesting to me how people can point fingers and say that's wrong, that's bad, if it's in a dramatic and not upper class or middle class context. But if it's silly and fun and, it's attractive man doing it, then, it must be fine and it's a funny movie.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because John Hughes kind of, has these kind of split, we talked about in class today, these split theses. I mean, he, on one hand, he wants to cross these class lines in a film like Pretty in Pink.
Yeah.
Andy ends up, who is part of a middle to lower class bracket. She ends up with Blaine, who is most certainly part of an upper class.
Yeah.
And then in Some Kind of Wonderful, the exact opposite happens, where instead of crossing those class boundaries and finding a balance between them and finding each other's differences and overcoming that, he ends up with Watts, who is part of his class.
Yeah.
Essentially, even though he wanted to be with Amanda, who is perceived as upper class.
Yeah. When I watch these movies and, like, I see these relationships and, like, the girl going for the guy or the guy going for the girl or whatever, it's interesting because I think we look at relationships very differently, or at least many women do, now than we did in the 80s.
I would agree, yeah.
Because, like, there's obviously, everyone has that thing where, like, they're attracted to someone and, like, they want to go for them. That's going to be a thing forever. But, like, specifically on the women's side, like, for example, in Pretty in Pink, like, with Blaine and Andy, Blaine never really did anything for her. Like, he liked her and she liked him, but, like, love isn't just I love you and let's, that's enough. It's never enough. You have to go out of your way to make sure that the other person feels safe and, comfortable in the relationship.
I mean, loving someone is through your actions. It's not just saying I love you.
Exactly.
It's like you have to show that.
And so, like, when she said, like, I don't want to go to this party for this, and this, and, like, laid it all out, and he was like, no, we're going to the party. And, like, just not listening to her. And then when it actually happened, like, I'm sorry. I know I'm not in this weird class system that John Hughes thinks we are in, but, like, if my significant other was getting harassed by my friends, they would no longer be my friends. Like, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Yeah. Like, you need to treat your significant other like they're your significant other, not like they're nothing, you know? Yeah.
So John Hughes kind of has these, like, complicated relationships with how we handle relationships through class. I mean, we've talked in like class, a lot about class. Like different social statuses and how that sets people apart, makes them different, makes them similar. So that's definitely a big topic that Hughes covers.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me is that like there's a little, I mean there is in the movies, but there isn't a lot of nuance to the differences of class in them.
Okay.
Like they're putting the two classes on the same field. Like, oh, if you're upper class and you're lower class, you're treated the same. Whereas...
Really?
Well, here are my thoughts.
Okay, I want to hear it.
So, when we look at Pretty in Pink, like, she's getting harassed by all these upper class people for no reason other than that they perceive her as lower class. And Blaine is angry with her because she, like, perceives him as upper class and she won't go out to a party with his friends. And he's like, why won't you take a chance on me? It's not about that. It's not about, I mean, I'm sorry. I'm sure that there's that whole thing of, like, everyone wants to date a prince because they want to be in that upper echelon of society.
Sure.
Like, no one is like, oh, I don't want to date you because you're rich. Like, that doesn't make any sense. It's mainly because rich people perceive poor people a certain way and then treat them that way. It's not because of anything else. Okay, and so, like...
Do you think John Hughes feels that way?
I don't know him.
Well, but, like, thinking about, like, his movies and the conclusions they come to.
Yeah, and so when I look at his movies, I don't see enough of, like, realistic point of view of, like... Because, like, she gets with Blaine, and, like, everything's supposed to be okay. You know? And, like, then we see Some Kind of Wonderful, and then it's the opposite point of view.
It's the exact opposite.
But then we realize that Amanda actually isn't upper class, so none of it makes any sense.
Yeah. Some Kind of Wonderful definitely came to an interesting conclusion because is Watts not a lesbian? I'm sorry.
Okay. like none of it. Okay. My brain was going 50 miles per hour because
that's fast.
Because, like, she was like, someone called her a lesbian and she was, like, freaking out about it. And then
there's the scene in the locker room when she's looking at Amanda. Yes! So I was like, oh, she likes Amanda, and that's why she's mad at Keith.
Yes.
That's what I thought the whole tension was about. And at the end, when she's like, I just wanted to be with you, whatever.
Yeah.
I was like, what?
I thought she liked Amanda, and that whole locker room scene made no sense to me. And then when she was looking at, what's his face? Keith. I was like, okay, so does she like him? Like, but...
Because then, she kisses him because she's like, you need practice.
Yeah. Which was weird.
It's happened in movies, like that, I feel like it's kind of a trope.
That's a crazy trope.
It happened in The Dove, and then...
Not The Dove.
Yeah. I don't know, I feel like I've seen it before, and it's just bonkers.
It is bonkers.
Bonkers.
Because, like, none of it makes sense. And also, if I was Watts, and I just drove my crush and his girlfriend on their first date, that was, like,
so extravagant,
so elaborate, so, like, he is so into her, and then he goes after me, I'm gonna be like, girl, like, no. Like, no.
Yeah.
I want someone that actually wants me, sorry. Like, that's crazy.
I was so confused by the ending, it's not even funny.
It's not even funny.
Was like, so Amanda was just like, you actually like this other girl, and I was like,
What pointed her to that direction?
Yeah, what?
Yeah.
Yeah, like, what made Amanda think that?
I don't know.
Literally, I feel like she's had no interaction with Watts.
No.
They don't know each other.
They don't.
And Watts is a lesbian in my mind, so it doesn't make sense.
I mean, it's going against John Hughes conventions as well, because, Another thing about is a pillar of John Hughes films is that he has every girl looks the exact same. Every guy looks the exact same. They're all white. It's a white family with no people of color.
Or, I mean, we can dive into this too, but when you do see a person of color, it's in the homeless shelter. It's in detention. They're always in places of not acceptable social standing.
Exactly. No, that's a good point, and we can dive into that later. But, my point is, like, when we're watching all these John Hughes films, and there's a clear pattern of stuff, so you expect things out of his movies, and then so we get this character, and oh no, she has short hair, and she dresses not like the stereotypical woman, and so she's a lesbian, but then they were showing that she was a lesbian.
Yeah, that's like fine if like she's like that's just like how she is and that's how she dresses. But then they hint towards it with the locker room scene. And people actively call her that. And then she has that like other boyfriend thing that she's like, get away from me, I don't like you. So then I was like, okay, so
because I mean he was weird. He was weird, to be fair.
That was a weird guy.
It was a weird guy. But like why I don't know. I told Cassie, I was like, this whole movie felt like a dream. Like nothing made sense and I was just along for the ride.
Fever dream for real.
Yeah.
That was a really strange one.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. So...
Do we want to talk about, like, the people of color?
Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
I mean, I just think it's really interesting that... Has John Hughes had a main character who isn't white? If I look at his films so fast.
No, the only one I mean, she's not a main character, so it doesn't matter. But the only person I can think of that is a character in the film is the assistant to Gray.
The assistant to Gray. Okay. Yeah, which is like so like not a main
minuscule,
character at all.
I know.
Yeah, because I mean, at least all of his leads.
Yeah.
They all look the same. I'm gonna be so honest with you. I had a really hard time telling Keith and the other guy apart for like the first 45 minutes.
What other guy? Oh, the boyfriend?
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah.
That's so funny. Yeah. They're like paralleling this to Friends because there's been a lot of backlash recently about how Friends, the show, is based in New York and has very little people of color as characters.
And New York is New York and such a diverse place.
Yeah, and like not only has, now currently, but like back in the 80s things were more rigid, so like fashion was similar and stuff like that, but like people of color and like sexuality and all of that was like rampant, or not rampant, but like, prominent. And so like it, John Hughes, I know that is it Chicago that they're in mostly?
Yeah,
Yeah. And like in Ferris Bueller they have, no people of color aside from like the side characters that we get in the parade, which mean, those are real people, so they should. But like, a lot of, what movie is it? Curly Sue is in a city, and I know that The Great Outdoors is not, but like
they're both still Midwest.
Yes. And
settings.
And so like it doesn't showcase like real life, and I know that John Hughes is a white man, so maybe he doesn't see, maybe he's hindering himself on that part, and so he doesn't see the world as it is, but
sure.
I don't know.
I think he has sort of this idea of the like perfect American life, and unfortunately that can be some kind of a flawed notion. Like there's this whole, I really think he chases sort of this idea of like the perfect American dream, and sometimes he works to challenge that, but it's a typical family, and the family unit is typically almost always restored by the end. If we think about Curly Sue, it's a very unconventional family, let's just say. It's Curly Sue and then her father figure Bill, like trying to figure it out in the world. But then eventually the family unit is restored because Bill falls in love with Gray, and they move into a gorgeous house.
Mm-hmm.
And they move in with Gray. So there's sort of always a morality, a moral ending at the end where they're returning to that American dream. And we read an article about that in class called The American Dream of Family in Film. And I think this article makes an interesting point that, like, people often get their, like, first impressions of the world through film. And there's a quote that says, viewers often gain their first insights into the, quote, real world through exposure to the mass media of film and television. So they might watch these films and they might see all of the only white characters and then interpret the world in a certain way, and it won't be a realistic portrayal. Or it might skew their version of what reality is, not prepare them for the world. Just give them a skewed notion of what life can be like, and it only offers them one option of this white middle-class family.
Yeah.
Mom, dad, 2 kids, you know? It doesn't really offer any other solutions, any other possibilities. And if it does, it usually reaches that by the end of the film.
Yeah. And, like, you know, we talk about this in class, but, like, you can definitely see John Hughes' relationship with his parents in these movies.
That's a good angle, yeah.
Yeah, like, I have a very different relationship with my parents than he did. So, like, when I watch these movies, it's hard for me to, like, relate to any of the characters because it's like, oh, like, that would never happen to me. You know? Like, for example, like, in the movie Mr. Mom, in this movie, the dad becomes the, like, caretaker of his 2 or 3 kids. And the mom works because he got laid off in the beginning of the movie and she got a job.
Just such a silly concept.
Such a silly concept. Why would men ever? And, like, he just has no parental bone in his body. Like, he doesn't know how to cook. He doesn't know how to clean. He doesn't know how to do anything.
He, like, doesn't know his children at all. When he, like, in the beginning of the movie, when he picks up the kid, he, like, holds them, like, at arm's length away. And I was like, that's your child. Like,
yeah. And, like, I grew up with, my dad actually got laid off when I was kind of young. He has a job now. But, he took care of me for a year, like, being the full, like, stay-at-home caretaker. And my mom worked, and then he got a job the next year. But, you know, he's still, like, in high school and stuff, like, he was the one that cooked, that cleaned. You know, he's always been that person that I can talk to. And my mom, too. But, like, you know, he talks, you know, if I have something going on, like, he'll talk to me, you know. He texts me heart emojis all the time.
That's so cute.
And, like, he emails me or texts me, like, he reads all my articles every week. And, like, just, like, you know, wears a ton of Winona State merch because he's like, I just want to be proud of you.
Aww.
And, like, it makes me feel like when I watch these movies and I'm supposed to be like, oh my god, a man being a dad, you know, like, I just, like, damn, like, I feel sad because it's like, if it's so rambunctious that a dad can be a dad, like, I feel sorry for these people that think that way. Yeah. Because clearly they grew up where they didn't have a dad, or, like, their dad wasn't present. Which makes me feel sad. But, like, it also, like, makes me not be able to relate to the movie, because I'm like, am I supposed to feel for the main character? Because I'm feeling for the kids right now, because clearly they're not getting a present father.
Yeah, and that's definitely interesting, like, commentary on the 80s, because, I mean, the 80s, there was a big recession in the 80s, and then Reagan became president, and there was sort of this cultural shift to, like, return back to, like, traditional values and the traditional nuclear family. Yeah. So the progress that was made in the 60s and 70s kind of got diminished a little bit, and that's getting, like, kind of political, but, like, it does apply to film still, because those, like I was saying earlier, like, art imitates life and life imitates art. Like, those ideas that were pushed by political leaders were then reflected in films. And maybe people tried to challenge that. And I mean, I know you didn't like Mr. Mom, but I do think it, like, still made efforts to try and, like, challenge what was the traditional idea at the time.
Yeah. It's not that I didn't necessarily not like Mr. Mom. It's just like I wouldn't watch it currently.
Yeah.
Things that I did like about it are like it is interesting to like see that. You know, it's interesting to see what the ideals were back in the day.
Yeah.
And like how this movie is probably like out there for its time.
Yeah.
You know, and like wow, like we've gone so far, you know.
Yeah. And that's what I think is so interesting about John Hughes, because I think there are a lot of traditional 80s values, these like sort of traditional family things, like I was talking about earlier, this sort of nuclear family unit that he always returns back to in movies like Curly Sue, in Dutch. Yeah, but then he also like makes strokes to challenge these ideas. He offers different ideas of what a traditional family might be, like in Mr. Mom or in Pretty in Pink. Andy, the main character in Pretty in Pink, her mom left her and her dad, and she has to take care of herself and her father. So it's interesting looking at the specific family values that are in his movies, because I do think family values are a big part of his filmography and a big part of what he likes to work with. So he kind of like goes back and forth on what his ideas are about that, I think.
Yeah, for sure. It, you know, I don't know. It's just interesting. Yeah.
I agree. So we've talked a little bit about sort of his style and the themes that he has in his movies. We've talked also in class about auteur theory. And last week on this podcast, we talked a little bit about what an auteur is with Cooper and our discussion about Wes Anderson. But I want to give the listeners like a quick little refresher. Here's a quick quote from the Encyclopedia of Literary and Cultural Theory, and it reads, "Auteur theory is a critical model used in film studies and criticism that locates the director and as the author of a film and emphasizes a definition of cinema as a product of the director's personal singular vision." So a lot of people today like debate whether if this is still a relevant theory, like a relevant point of analysis. In this article further, like there's one critic calling auteur theory a misogynistic, incoherent, and restrictive.
Yeah.
Do you think auteur theory is still relevant? Do you think we can use it to analyze directors?
I think it's a tool that can be used wisely. I think thus far we haven't used it as wisely as we could.
In this class or in general?
No, in general, sorry. Because like I mean like when we think of auteurs, we think of Alfred Hitchcock, we think of Tarantino, all those people. But, you know, I think people like Greta Gerwig, like Jordan Peele, like those people are also in my mind auteurs, and yet they haven't been called that because of how restrictive auteur theory is. But, you know, I think film in a certain way is going in a direction that brings voices that are different than a white man's to light.
And I think, I mean, not to get like sappy, but I think that's why like film criticism, film reviews, and like things like podcasts are like still really important, is because we can bring those movies into light. We can bring those into the public eye. Like I wrote a long analysis piece about all of Greta Gerwig's films, and I do think she's an auteur. She has such a signature way of creating characters, and I think that's what makes her stand out. But
and like, you know, there's always, as long as we don't address it, which currently is not happening, there's always going to be those people that are going to say like, you know, Greta Gerwig hates men, and, you know, Jordan Peele doesn't deserve it because of blank, blank, blank. You know, there's always going to be racist people out there. There's always going to be sexist people out there. There's always going to be, you know, especially in America where we have individualism. And so, you know, we haven't addressed yet that because of these things, you know, auteur theory doesn't come easily to these types of people. And so these are the directors that I love because I'm someone who, and I hope that more people out there are, but someone who loves movies that aren't just something that I've seen before, and like
Mhm.
something that, because Jordan Peele has a mind that is like no other. I mean, he creates horror films that are fantastic.
Which, an interesting note, he comes
Yeah.
from a background of sketch comedy. Him and Michael Key, they have a sketch comedy show, and then he's hard laughs into making amazing horror films.
No, literally.
That are also like such strong social commentary about like race. And
yes.
I love it so much.
Yeah, like those movies are perfect. And like every single movie, although unique in their own way, has the same type of underlying outline. And I feel like Jordan Peele is an auteur, and I feel like Greta Gerwig is an auteur, even though her movies as well like are very different in their style and like, or not their style, but like their story and stuff like that.
And their aesthetics, I think, are different.
But they have the same kind of social commentary. And, you know, auteur theory, you know, although is similar, you know, Alfred Hitchcock has a similar type of horror movie. You know, all of those. Quentin Tarantino has a very similar type of action movie. But auteur theory can open up to be also, you know, the same type of social commentary.
Yep.
The same type of this, you know, it doesn't have to be one thing, which can open up to more people being able to do that, you know?
Which I think is interesting to, circling it back to John Hughes, like, John Hughes has only directed, actually, 8 films, but he's written
so many more.
53, he has 53 writing credits. Not all of them are, like, specifically him writing it. So do you think him being a writer can qualify as an auteur?
Yeah, I would say yes. I would. I think, you know, when you watch a John Hughes film, whether he directed it, wrote it, whatever, you know it's from John Hughes. And you know that it's going to be either a teen film or like slapstick comedy or like that kind of movie.
Yeah.
And I feel like if you know that, then he can be labeled as an auteur.
Yeah. I think it may be a less of like visual style, although a lot of his films are quite visually similar, just they're not really like calling attention to their visual style, but they're very similar in story structure. And I think that might be what makes connects all of his films and makes him stand out as a type of auteur. He has such a specific, like I said, a story structure where good always prevails at the end. He holds firm to maybe a happy family unit, and he shows a version of family life that, I don't know, like usually makes you feel really good inside, or has all of his films have a hint of teen romance to them as well. Some of them that might be the central storyline or a sub-storyline. Teens coming of age, that's a huge theme in his movies.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people think about their coming of age through the lens of John Hughes films. So, yeah, I'd agree with you. I think his writing style is definitely auteuristic, if that can be qualified as a word.
Yeah.
Do you think that story structure, that style that he has, do we see that in movies today? Do you think people have taken inspiration from it? I
definitely do in like the teen genre movie, like the Netflix romantic comedy sort of vibe.
Oh,
like,
okay.
I know Dr. Schwartz was talking about this, but like it, you know, like in the movies like To All the Boys I've Loved Before, Kissing Booth, you know, all those like ones that teen girls usually like watch.
Yeah.
Like I see a lot of like that same type of fashion in it. It's interesting because like you don't see a lot of like those quote unquote grittier themes anymore though in them. Like it's mostly just like, oh, I like a boy, like let's try to figure out how to get him, you know. And speaking of, it's funny how there's no teen movies about boys trying to get girls. Yeah.
There has to be.
There's gotta be one, bro.
I mean, I don't know about today. Like some of John Hughes, like Some Kind of Wonderful. That's what that's about.
Oh, you're right.
But
I haven't seen one today, I guess.
Yeah. Like teen comedies with like,
The only one that I can even think of really that has a boy as a main character is Love, Simon, but that's about him coming out as being gay. So
yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah. Interesting. But like you can see a lot of John Hughes like in teen like types of movies. You know, and I that makes sense because that was his specialty as well.
Yeah. I also think you see a lot of his influence in Judd Apatow movies. Judd Apatow is like a writer-director. He does a lot of producing nowadays, but he's directed or written films like Trainwreck, Pineapple Express, and The 40-Year-Old Virgin. Judd Apatow movies definitely have a raunchier side to them, and they're more like sex comedies. But they always still have like a happy morality at the end. Like morality always prevails, and a family unit structure is restored in some way.
Yeah.
And so I think like that kind of story structure, like we were just talking about with him being an auteur, that those story beats persist in all of his work. I think that carries over to sort of the studio comedies that Judd Apatow created or produced.
Yeah, I've seen Pineapple Express. And it was one of my favorite movies that we watched in our comedy class.
No freaking way.
Yeah. Well, it was just like silly, you know,
Yeah.
and I like silly. And like it's such a stupid movie, but it's a fun movie. I liked it.
I agree.
Yeah.
So now to close out the pod, I want to talk about our top 3 John Hughes movies. These would be ones that he's directed or written. So I want to start out with number 3 and then go up to 1. So do you have a third favorite?
My third favorite would probably be The Great Outdoors.
No freaking way!
Yeah, I just like, you know, I'm from Minnesota, and I was like, that's so funny. It was giving, it reminded me of, so in 2020, or maybe it's 2021, no, it's 2020, I was like stuck in a dorm, and my friend came from North Dakota, and I was a very, very, very safe individual during COVID. We both took tests, okay? We both, like, were very safe. I had not talked to anyone since, you know, in, like, months.
Yep.
And we were like, we should get a hotel. And no one around us would take people under 21. And so we went to this place 40 minutes away in Wisconsin that looked a lot like the place in The Great Outdoors.
No way.
Yeah, I'm not even kidding.
That's actually really hilarious.
I know. And so it just reminded me of that, and like just the Wisconsin and Minnesota people, they just get so right. So I liked that.
I know. I love seeing, like, Fargo is one of my favorite movies because I think it's so funny. Like, oh, you bitch, yeah. Okay, so my third favorite John Hughes movie, this is one he wrote, it's Home Alone.
So fair.
It's just a movie that I literally watch every year. Not even around Christmas time sometimes, but like it's such a fun movie. It's so happy. Like, it's so happy. And I think, like I was talking about earlier, the 90s really mark a shift, I think, where he sort of maybe did like less grittier things and moved towards working with kids, writing about kids, kid families, things like that. So we had Dutch, bad movie.
So bad, very bad, no good.
We don't like Dutch on this podcast. But
Bro.
Curly Sue is, you know, it's Curly Sue. And then Home Alone is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about your second?
My number 2 would probably be Ferris Bueller. This one is interesting because, like, I like how Ferris Bueller, if you, like, watch it and don't think, it's a good movie. But if you watch it, and you actually pay attention, it's also, like, a really interesting movie.
Yeah.
Because, like, if you pay attention to especially Cameron, bro, and, like, the relationship between Cameron, Ferris, and Sloane, it's so interesting. And, like, it's something you can actually, like, pay attention to.
Yeah. That movie has layers.
Yes. Also, I'm gonna say this. They are in a 3-way relationship, and I need everyone to know that.
It's a throuple, it's confirmed. I've decided.
It's gotta be. It's gotta be. Yes.
All right, so my second film, top two, is The Breakfast Club.
Fair.
I just think, and we haven't watched it in class yet, but we're going to be.
We're gonna.
It captures like such a teen experience that just really like shows like what it's like growing up in different kinds of ways. Like you have these different people who come from these different social classes, or they come from different kinds of households, and you see how these people exist in the same high school, because you're essentially all put on the same level when you're in high school. You're all leveled to be the same.
Yeah.
So I think it's just a really interesting study about that, and kind of like what you're talking about with Ferris Bueller, but we always get these characters that there's more going on to them than the film reveals. So like in Ferris Bueller, like there's so much going on with Cameron that we don't always get all of the insight to. And then in The Breakfast Club, they're like all of these characters, we don't see their home lives at all. But they allude to things that are so much more complex and so much deeper. John Bender's dad, for example, talks about like possibly an abusive father, and those are like really deep ideas.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that we like kind of get a small window into that. Yeah. What about your number one?
My number one is The Breakfast Club. I just, it's, you know, for all the reasons that you said also, but it's funny to me how they make the girl with the dark hair uglier during the makeover.
I know.
It makes me go crazy.
That part does anger me. The makeovers, dude. What was that about?
What was that? But I don't know, like it reminds me of like my experience in high school.
Okay,
you know, like kind of being with all these different types of people, and like realizing that everyone is different, and like some people have like stuff, like the people that are like rambunctious or like kids that go out of like the line are usually kids that have a bad home life. And like the kids that are like nerds, it's usually because like they got parents that are gonna like kill them if they get a B. Yeah, you know, and like all this stuff, like you realize that everyone has like a reason for how they are, and so like you love them for who they are because of that.
Yeah.
You know, everyone has a backstory. You know, there might be a certain type of person that is completely opposite of you, but that doesn't mean that they're bad people. It usually just means that they have a certain amount of experiences that led them there.
Exactly,
you know?
Yeah.
And so I just think that it showed that really nicely in this movie.
I 100% agree.
Yeah.
So interestingly enough, my top film is Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Oh my god, no way.
We had a flip top two. Which I think is really interesting because I like actually hate this movie. Because like Ferris bothers me so much. I don't like how Ferris treats Cameron at all, but I'll be darned if this isn't the movie I think about the most. I think about Ferris Bueller so often.
Are you Cameron?
I'm Cameron for real. No, just kidding. I don't know. I just feel for Cameron a lot. Yeah. Because I've been in Cameron's shoes. And I really think the movie at the end of the day is about Cameron. And I think that's so interesting. And I think there's this energy in that movie that just can't be found in his other films. Like there's such of this like euphoric like teen experience where they're just like happy to be alive. Like Ferris is an ass, but like he does like have all of this charm and charisma that like nobody else can match. Yeah. And he creates this day for his friends that's like so memorable. And he just like, maybe I want to be Ferris at the end of the day. I don't know. I want to be Ferris without being mean. But Ferris Bueller's Day Off resonates me in a way that no other movie does. Yeah. The scene when they're in the art museum and like Cameron is like having these moments of like self-discovery, and he's like looking out the window and looking at the entire world below him, and then like looking into this painting, and he like sees all of these blurry dots, and he's like, how do I make sense of this? Yeah. That's so deep, man, and I love it so much.
I actually, not to flex, Okay.
Have you seen that painting?
No.
Oh,
I was in Chicago, and I did that, like, looking down from the tallest building thing. And they actually have, like, a thing now. I guess apparently in the 80s they didn't, but they have, like, when you're at the top, they have, like, a thing where you can actually do it.
Oh.
And you have to pay. Haha, capitalism.
You have to pay to look out a window.
Literally. And it does make you feel like, oh my god, like, I'm freaking out right now, but, like, there's nothing, like, everything is safe, you know?
Yeah.
And so, like, it makes you feel like, wow, you know?
Yeah.
Jeez.
That movie just really gets me thinking about things. Well, Sophie, I really just want to thank you for coming on my show again.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I think you have such great nuanced thoughts about film, and I just love talking to you about it so much.
I'm blushing.
But Sophie, before we go, is there anything you want to plug?
Oh, you know, I got Instagram, official.sophia, Sophia, because people call me Sophie and Sophia, and they're like, which one? And I'm like, both.
Both at the same time.
But then my bio says Sophie, so, and then, you know, I got a letterbox. I think it's just Sophie Sailor. Cassie follows me, so just look on hers.
Yep.
But yeah.
I love it.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, you can find me on Letterboxd at Cassidy_Lynn. You can read my work in the Winonan, where I write weekly film reviews. You can also see my stuff on Film Obsessive, where you can read more in-depth reviews of mine, as well as some longer form analysis pieces. You can also tune in every other week right here on the POV Winona blog to hear a critical conversation about new film releases. Episodes are released every other Friday at noon. All right, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Real Film Talk. Bye!